Hello and welcome to Christian Concerns Round the Table on this special day, Friday, 15th of March. Really great to have you with us today as we explore some of the important stories in the news this week for Christians. I'm glad to have with me our Head of Public Policy, Tim Dieppe, and also our Public Policy Researcher, Carys Moseley, to speak about some of these really important issues that we've got going today. So if you're there watching live on YouTube, or on Facebook, please get your comments in. We'd really love to hear from you as we talk about these important issues, hear your perspectives, your opinions, your comments, your questions. We really love to see that. So do get involved that way if you can. But great to have you here. And we've got two particularly important issues today to speak about. And one of them, which Tim's going to introduce in a moment, is extremism. The government has a new definition of extremism, which could affect Christians. Tim, do you want to explain what's going on there?
Thanks, Paul. Yeah. So the government, in a widely sort of covered and high-profile announcement, brought out a new definition of extremism. Let me just read it to you because it's kind of interesting to see what it says. It says, extremism is the promotion or advancement of an ideology based on violence, hatred, or intolerance that aims to, and then there's 3 points, but I'll focus on point one. Point one, negate or destroy the fundamental rights and freedoms of others. Now, my concern about this is they haven't defined what fundamental rights and freedoms of others is. And so some people would say that being able to, my body, my choice, fundamental right to have an abortion. And then if I want to negate that right or am opposed to that right, then am I being extremist? And so you have to be intolerant and wanting to negate a fundamental right or freedom of another person. And that would mean a pro-life person could be deemed an extremist according to this definition. And in fact, we already know that being anti-abortion has been found to be on a prevent list of ideologies seen as potential signs of extremism. So it's already the case that this is seen that way. And I think this is very concerning. And then if you think, what about a right to marriage? Is that a fundamental right? And therefore, people who are opposed to same-sex marriage could be seen as people who want to negate or destroy someone else's fundamental rights or freedoms, and therefore intolerant, and therefore qualify as extremist. Or what about a right to identify in a chosen gender? Does that qualify as a fundamental right and freedom? And if it does, then here I am, and I'm opposed to, I'm a gender critical person, and I don't believe in transgender ideology, and I don't think people should be allowed to change gender. Does that make me an extremist? Well, maybe it does. And so I think this definition is alarmingly vague in what it says. It's wide open to abuse by people calling people extremists. We've already had some Christians referred to Prevent, the government's counter-terrorism organization, for expressing their Christian beliefs. Most famously, Reverend Dr. Bernard Randall preached a sermon in a school chapel in which he said students are free to disagree with LGBT ideology, and for that he was reported to Prevent. Another Christian teacher, Svetlana Powell, was reported to Prevent after engaging in a private conversation with a pupil in which she said God loves you to a lesbian pupil and expressed her disagreement with LGBT ideology. So I think this is quite concerning. I think it's a real issue. Obviously, the government have named 3 Islamist organizations and 2 far-right organizations as examples of extremist organizations. The threat is that they cancel them in terms of no access to government funding, no access to government lobbying or anything like that. Could this mean that Christian organizations like Christian Concern would actually be banned from contacting
we missed out on all that government money, Tim. Is that right?
Well, we haven't got any government money, so that's not something we'll miss. But it's the access and being deemed extremist and having that label, and then you're not allowed to engage with the government. You're barred from it, kind of thing. That's kind of what could happen here. So I'm bothered about it. Obviously, the government is denying that this is a problem. They're saying, "Oh no, it doesn't mean free speech is allowed," and all this kind of thing. But the definition, according to what it says, is vague. I mean, it just is. And it does, if it said, it's the intolerance aspect, how do you define intolerance? If I don't believe in same-sex marriage, does that make me intolerant? many people would say so.
You've looked quite a lot at Prevent, I think, and these sorts of issues of Islamization of in France as well as in the UK, and how we've done a bad job at kind of addressing that accurately. What's your take on this?
So you're talking to me?
Yeah.
On France and Britain. So that's a really tricky comparison because France is officially a secular state, and more people talk about the concept of Islamization in policy, and also de facto. It is what Michael Gove is trying to address. And I really feel for Michael Gove here, because the word extremism is the word for hardline Islam in policy. If you don't believe me, you can look at Robin Simcox, who's the Commissioner for Countering Extremism. It's also been said in Parliament by MPs from Northern Ireland, pointing out that Prevent doesn't exist in Northern Ireland. It is about the threat of the link between terrorism and as a weapon to gain sympathy for Muslims, or to bully in the name of Muslims, as if they're all thinking the same, which we know they're not. But of course, nobody can say the word Islam. One of the reasons is that the governments across the world don't want to face lawfare, litigation from Islamist hardliners complaining about definitions. So they use the word extremism. And of course, then that catches lots of other people potentially. So what Tim's talking about is, yes, there's the literal meaning, the logic of the text, absolutely, but also the way we know that it has been misapplied maliciously to waste the time of a watchdog like Prevent and similar organizations. So the thing is, when you ask about France, I don't think France has anything as extensive as Prevent, because Prevent has had a very social aspect to it, almost a social justice, if you like, tone to how it's been, and that's why it was criticized. But France has similar problems with Islamists getting government grants, despite its official secularism. So comparing France to Britain and saying, look, France is doing something, it's not going to work. Secularists here look at France, and there are people who write in sort of centre-right newspapers in Britain, who've got the ear of government, who look to France, and there is a partnership between Britain and France. But I want us to guard from going down everything about the French route for lots of reasons. One of the things we were able to have this conversation about Christian beliefs and so on. And one of the reasons we can do that and engage with government and other agencies is that the census allows you to record in a very vague way whether you affiliate with a religion. It doesn't mean what you believe, but it's culturally where you feel at home. Is it Christianity, is Islam, or whatever? France doesn't have that. And so in France, you can't really officially count the number of Muslims, Christians, etc. And so that creates problems for a rational conversation and debate with government and in society. And there are battles all the time. And of course, there's an election coming up in France, which means the president is keen to crack down on certain preachers.
But Carys, just going back to Prevent, isn't it true that only 16% of referrals recently have actually been Islamist? Or Islamic
of course,
related?
But that's a problem within Prevent, and it's clear that it's been infiltrated. And William Shawcross talked about it being steered, and of course, part of that is trying to find more of what they call far-right extremists. There are lots of different groups like anarchists or whatever, or animal rights people who might want to plant bombs or be a serious nuisance and be subversive. But one of the reasons they pick on far-right is that we know that it's on the rise, and we know they target Jews, as do Islamists at times. And they will sometimes work together as well. But of course, the other thing that far-right has done for over 20 years, or parts of it, not all of it, is to co-opt Christian rhetoric. And fill the vacuum where too few people in government and society have listened to what some Christians, like Christians, have had to say about the challenge of Islamization. And that, I think, is at the heart of, then you have this vacuum. We've had, you've got this lobby that's against Prevent as Islamist, but you've also got this steering and infiltration as Islamist, and their friends who care about some of their topics. So you've got to tackle that, and that's not an easy matter. I don't think I'm not sure what kind of wording of extremist will really help. I mean, Michael Gove still had to name those 3 Islamist organizations and 2 neo-Nazi organizations in Parliament to explain what it's all about.
Yep.
So we'll get into that in a moment, and maybe Tim, I'll come to you about these definitions and what the government should be doing. I just wanted to say hello to Michael and to Carol on YouTube with their comments. Really great to hear from you, as we often do. Also, this question from the lodger: have people seen the whistleblower telling about the COV baptizing failed asylum seekers who then go on to commit crimes? I think you're referring to Matthew Firth, who we know well at Christian Concern, and he gave evidence to the
Home Affairs Select Committee, I think it was.
Home Affairs Select Committee on that this week. I don't think that was specifically about them going on to commit crimes, but that some people who have been baptized and had claimed to be Christians have gone on to commit or attempt to commit terrorist acts. So, Tim, if that is the situation, if the government is really trying to address these sorts of issues, maybe to actual terror attacks, but maybe also the sorts of things we saw in Parliament a few weeks ago, how should it address these issues of extremism? Is extremism the right word?
Well, I think extremism is notoriously difficult to define unless you say something like carrying out or promoting or encouraging acts of violence. I'll be happy with that as a definition. All right, for political aims, let's say, carrying out or encouraging or promoting acts of violence for political aims. You said that's extremist. We would all agree. Oh yeah, that's extremist.
That's incitement to violence.
No, exactly. And then this character, Mr. Begg, who was who sued for libel when he was called an Islamist or whatever, and then he lost because the judge said, well, actually, he said that committing violence in the name of Islam is the greatest thing you can do. Now that is extremist, right? So, so there we are, and he would qualify under that definition. So, I think that's the thing. And then the other thing, of course, is that really, while there are far right groups, but it's 80% plus of the terrorist activity in this country is Islam related, and 80% plus of the people who are convicted of terrorism offences are Muslim, Islam motivated, and so on. So we need to name that and say that and talk about that and discuss that, and then move on from that to, is there an actual problem with Islam itself? Which I've written an article, is Islam religion of peace, and read it and see for yourself and see what the texts say and see what the example of Muhammad is, and so on. So that's where we need to go to. That's what we need to think about. The link between Islam and Islamic terrorism, and what are we going to do about it? So we need to tackle it specifically. We need to name it. We need to not be afraid of naming it, and we need to say this is the real problem here.
I think also when you're in all of this comment, you see that's not really being said in the press, but what has been said once by one journalist in the Telegraph, which I think helps illuminate all this, is this definition was crafted with the Islamists in mind, and typically they are. But however, they're being carried out by civil servants, many of whom think refusing gender self-ID is a hate crime. And so already you have lost in translation how there are people who want to divert it, if you like. Partly because they're being cynical, but also there is a problem that Shawcross identified, which is you've got to keep Muslims on board with Prevent, because you've got and the channel panels, which is when they really get into trying to have discussions with people, mentor them to get them out of the path of terrorism. And so to do that, they have to show that it's not just them and that there are other causes. So those are the levels that the government has to deal with. It's a never-ending merry-go-round. So with the thing is, like, within the government, do we see any prospect of that changing? Or is it up to those outside to be communicating in a smarter way about the problems?
Yeah, we've got such an issue with these definitions. What is extremism? What are, in this definition, what are the fundamental rights and freedoms of others, as you mentioned? People will claim all sorts of things are rights, and at the moment we got people saying there is a right to die, right for euthanasia, assisted suicide, and it seems that rights don't mean something that is really fundamental to who you are as a Christian, as a person, but rights are just things you want and the government can give you. And people will campaign for a right because they want the government to make sure that they have that right, but it's not really, it's not a genuine right. You know, Christians would say that there are genuine freedoms that come from the dignity of being made in God's image as man and woman, and that there are some ways that we shouldn't be treated by others because of that dignity. So we shouldn't be killed, for example, because of that dignity that we have as humans. But this ever expansion of rights into being whatever someone wants and the government can give you means that then when you're talking about wanting to restrict other people's fundamental freedoms or rights, then all of this other stuff comes along, the right to same-sex marriage and all the things that you mentioned, Tim. And of course, we redefined marriage. That was a redefinition that completely changed this situation. We redefined man to mean also women.
I know it's only 10 years ago. You know, it's a new thing. You know, it's just totally valid to sort of say, well, I don't agree with it. And there's no referendum on it. It's like that, you know, either. So, you know, yeah.
But I think also the issue of rights is what are rights is that one that very few people ask themselves. That you don't see it a lot outside of a few academic circles. So is a right a fundamental need, like to have food and water? Is it a desire for something, and if so, for what? Why should if it is valid in one way morally, like or is it a capacity that you should be able to talent you should be able to exercise for the good of society? What is it? There are lots of sources for rights, but because human rights have become the overarching moral paradigm for how you work in the law and in passing laws and policies, and sort of the criteria by which you pass laws, you know, when in Parliament they say, does it conform to the European Convention of Human Rights or whatever? That's the issue as well, and that's happened in our lifetimes. It's kind of very few politicians sit down and unpick it because they're in the system, I suppose, and they all have to use it. So that's when a Christian perspective is longer, that looks at, you know, there's varied histories in varied countries and places of how this came about is really crucial. Otherwise people get stuck in sort of infighting about things that can be relatively small.
Yep.
Well, some interesting discussion there. Some really important issues that we'll be coming back to over and over again, I expect, in the coming weeks. This discourse about extremism and fundamental human rights and these sorts of things, and British values and so on, has been going on for many, many years, and never have we managed to really tie down exactly what's meant by them. But I expect this will keep on going. Lots of really interesting comments on Facebook and on YouTube as we've been talking. I want to bring up Rainy Gibbs. He's very common on our Facebook comments. The separation of church and state cannot be vast enough. I'm not sure if he means vast or fast there. I think he's quite negative about us. I think he means that he doesn't want any Christian influence in public policy, which is his freedom to not want that. But we believe that it's a very good thing for the world and societies to be influenced by Jesus Christ, as they are often influenced by many other things, and those other things aren't as good for anyone as Christ is. We need to move on to our next topic here. As we do, keep on putting in your comments. We've got one already that I'll bring up in a second on our next topic of puberty blockers. But I also want to remind people that if you're watching live, you can like this video. That really helps us. Just click the like button as you're going. It will really help more people see and join in with our discussion. Helen here has anticipated our next topic, saying giving puberty blockers to children is abuse. As for trying to stop the gospel, the word of God says heaven and earth will pass away, but my word will last forever. Thank you for your comment, Helen. Carys, puberty blockers. We've heard an announcement about NHS England this week. What does that really mean?
So it was announced this week. It was actually the outcome of a consultation that was done back in 2022, so just over a year ago. And they were looking at the gender services for children and teenagers. And they've now stopped. And so they will ban the prescription of puberty blockers by doctors to children in the NHS. Now, that's obviously great news because there are so many children who are on the waiting lists for these to deal with, being confused as they do want to be a boy or a girl, gender confusion. However, and of course we did encourage supporters to respond, and there were many, many other organizations and individuals that responded. However, and it's the caveats that interest me, because that, in other words, gives you the wider picture. This ban won't apply to private clinics. It cannot, because the NHS obviously doesn't run private gender clinics, and services doesn't apply when people buy and sell these substances online, which we know that some children already do. There are adults out there who want to supply them. Liz Truss, interestingly, wants the policy to be widened in this way, and she's got a private member's bill that's in Parliament today about that. And also the other real problem is puberty blockers will still be allowed in research trials. And we knew that from the consultation and the CAS review, which hasn't been completed. I personally think that's very clear. It's basically coming through the back door. Okay, the BBC says that individual clinicians can still apply to have these drugs funded for patients on a case-by-case basis. Well, we know that hard cases make bad law and bad policy. I just think we've got to be really watching what's going on there, because all the people who favour puberty blockers will want to make the case for their child being allowed onto these research trials. So there's a lot to look at there, I think.
I think that's
there are
right.
5,000 children on the waiting list, right? So there are some children who are on puberty blockers who are at the Gender Identity Development Service, and the Tavistock will be closing at the end of this month. But then they're going to be, in England, there are going to be 2 new gender hubs, and they're going to be Great Ormond Street Children's Hospital in London and Alder Hey Children's Hospital in Liverpool. And there are over 5,000 children and teenagers on this waiting list. It shows like a massive, massive increase from even 10 years ago, let alone 20, 30 years ago when the GIDS first opened.
So over several years, we've had kind of all these exposés of what's gone on at Tavistock, and the various kind of ways that children were treated there, and everyone's kind of agreed that the way that children were treated was bad, basically, and that's why it's been closed down. It's not because we think it's not that Tavistock was too small and we need to replicate the Tavistock model everywhere else. So the point of it shutting down was surely that it was failing children, and yet what is really going to be different about these gender hubs? You've just got an article out on our website. We can put the link there.
I think that's the big question.
Where coming from?
I think what's been going on, the truth is that debate's been going on and has happened before behind closed doors, which is, do you have a lot of therapists who affirm children's allegedly authentic cross-sex identity, transgender identity, versus do you have therapists who don't affirm it? Now, there are different ways of not affirming it, and currently the fashionable model is something called watchful waiting, where therapists just wait for the child to make his or her mind up. Well, they're children, and why should they be allowed to make their mind up to believe in an impossible fantasy that's going to cause harm? That's just as irresponsible, and it's not really an answer, but it is what's being promoted, really, because what people are not allowed to do is to insist the child must live according to his or her biological sex. That's considered conversion therapy. And all of the professional mental health bodies, as well as the NHS bodies, are signed up to the professional ban on conversion therapy, which is called the Memorandum of Understanding. And that's lurking in the background. That's not actually mentioned in any of this consultation documentation. I mean, we know because we've worked on it. And that's the real problem. So when you have these regional hubs, when I first saw them, I was really concerned, because I thought, well, at the moment you have one clinic, Tavistock, and you're going to multiply by 2. And then we now hear, only from the BBC this week, there's going to be lots more regional centres. And I think that's interesting. There are lots of gender clinics in England, both NHS and private. So what are the chances they're going to be linked? Because when you turn 18, some people, when they turn 18, are still in secondary school. And there's also a link between the GIDS and the Charing Cross, the adult gender service in London.
Yeah, so tell us about that. I mean, what is the history of this? All of this transgender medicine is rather spotted, isn't it? I mean, it's sort of made up on the hoof. I mean, you've also talked about the WPATH leak and that document this week, from last week.
Yeah. I mean, yeah, so the WPATH leaks came just before this announcement. This announcement of the consultation was obviously tied in, probably weeks or months in advance. The WPATH is this US-based World Professional Association of Transgender Health, which has been around for a while and which comes up with these standards of care. And it's currently in its 8th edition or version. And of course, they're all for giving hormones and puberty blockers to children. But there were leaks in the States, which were also published here nearly just 10, 11 days ago now, files, social media chats and videos by the leading clinicians in WPATH from between 2021 and 2024. And I mean, there's a huge 240-page report that's just been written about it. And most of it is showing this, photographing, screenshotting this material. It's very clear that the clinicians involved, whatever their moral views on transition for children, know that children don't understand the effects of all these procedures, like hormones and puberty blockers. They can't understand everything. They often have, like one of the clinicians admitted, some of them had a profound lack of understanding of human development. So, for example, some of these young people think they can pick and choose which sexual characteristics an artificial hormone can give you. So a girl who wants to be a boy thinks, well, maybe I'll just have facial hair if I want to. And that's not how it works. And that just shows the depth of fantasy thinking that's allowed in those circles. So,
it's all built on that fantasy, as you're saying, yeah?
Yeah, and of course, the fact is that WPATH, so everybody's backtracking now in Britain, saying, oh, no, we haven't signed up to WPATH. Nonsense. It was found that they've been influencing NHS policy for at least 10 years. But it's the philosophy that matters more than the exact organisation. We know that there's been a back and forth of clinicians from Britain going to WPATH conferences, being members and so on. And of course, they're backtracking. But I think the bottom line is that there's a little line, there are lots of quotes from this, from these leaks, but that they, so one of the clinicians actually says, we all want kids to be happy in the moment. That's why we give them these procedures and these substances, like drugs, and happy in the moment. And I think that for me was the biggest, the most important link, if you like, with all of this news about gender hopes, because they're not actually going to stop puberty blockers completely, as we said earlier. They are going to they're going to give a space for more conscientious parents to think again and to think, oh no, you've banned the prescription. Oh, prescription, that's a serious thing. But there'll still be those back doors.
Yeah, I think, Carys, the interesting thing here is that it's not as big a thing as it's been celebrated to be in the media in terms of a ban on puberty blockers. It's just the NHS, and even then, with the clinical trials are allowed, so the parents can say, "I want my child on that clinical trial," and even on a case-by-case basis, apparently they'll be able to apply for it. So it's not actually banned. We've not made it illegal to prescribe them, so private clinics can still prescribe them as well. So I think that's a real issue. And then these WPATH leaks. The doctors, are open, like the children don't understand. They haven't had biology lessons even. They don't know what they're doing. And they even are aware of cancer links with these puberty blockers. Yeah. And they still carry on prescribing them, even though they know that it's, associated with cancer or has caused some of their patients to develop cancers and so on. Yeah. So, I mean, it's very, very concerning. But nevertheless, this is a bit of a backlash against transgenderism. It is worth celebrating that the NHS has been barred from, other than in trials or possibly on a case-by-case cases. In general, they can't prescribe puberty blockers. And that does send a strong message that the government says, we don't think this is a good thing. And that is a shift in culture, and that is encouraging to see. I don't think we're the first country quite to do that, but one of the first countries to do that. And so this backlash against transgenderism is gaining pace and is growing, but it's not as big and significant as I think people think, and people will still find ways around this and so on.
They will, and the thing is that there will be people who want to fund the clinics as well. It's not just a case of some people, individual families finding their way around. It is the funding of more clinics, and then of course it ties into the debate of fundamental rights and freedoms. Do you have a fundamental right to this belief? because this is where the W path leaks are important, this business of being happy in the moment. Now, that phrase, I don't think that phrase has been used in Britain before, but it's clear that there's a notion of my personal happiness based on what's in my mind at the time, or what's been allowed to endure in my mind, even though it has no, it's not just it has no basis, it contradicts all that your body needs. And
if you took happy in the moment to its extreme, you'd never do a surgery to remove cancer.
Yeah, exactly. So it's a worldview issue, and I think that it's been good to have the W path leaks come out before this consultation. I'm not sure how many people are really investigating. Yes, there have been people showing that it's been a link between the W path and the kids, but it's not just a technical matter, which has been discussed. It's the worldview problem, which has been around for 5 decades in Britain as well, and it's among adults, and it's grown and grown very quietly. And the problem is, each time there's a debate or each time there's a exposure, what happens is, there's outrage and there's a backlash, but actually the number of people who then go to have gender clinic referrals, whether public or private, actually increases. And so to allow this loophole, I just want to emphasize, we don't know what the future will hold. You know, some children will be more protected than others. Some will be in the Wild West.
Thanks for that. I want to bring up a couple of comments here. One from Elizabeth. Watchful waiting, which Carys was talking about, harms children because it gives the impression that you will not receive tangible help unless it's to medically transition. That's a really important point. I mean, the reality is that someone is made male or female, and trying to change that is not going to work. And so we should be supporting people in their actual genuine identity as a man or woman, not in their kind of false one, which is a really simple thing, but that demonstrates why watchful waiting itself is a bit of an issue there. And then also, I'll just give you two both an option to respond to Christopher McCormick. He's had lots of questions for us. But this one on this point, also children can be expected to understand and be indoctrinated by your religion, but not which gender they are. Odd logic, Carys. Carys, Tim, do you want to respond to that at all?
I think, well, I mean, that's just a cynical take on when I talked about worldview. We do have a clash of worldviews, right? And also the ruling in favour of Maya Forstater talked about belief in that there are two sexes. And that's what the basis of male and female. We all have a right to that belief, and parents have the right to that belief as well, as do children. Okay, so you know, we don't know everything about people who are going into these clinics, but the reality is what they're not allowed to do in the clinic, like I said, is to point out the fact that there are only two sexes biologically. They've got a choice of other worldviews, which is around watchful waiting and a vagueness that Elizabeth complained about and how it can harm, and affirmation. But they don't have the choice of what we think and what probably most people think in regard to children. And you've got to understand that it's Chris who's out of step with public opinion here. So he's going to have to defend himself in the court of public opinion as well, I think.
There's also a comment from Colin. My recollections of being a child is that I didn't fully understand either Christianity or sexuality. But accepting Jesus did me no harm. Reminds me of Polycarp, his famous words. And I could have gone back on that in later life. Tim, any comments on that before we go on to our final topic?
That's a very interesting comment, isn't it? Because it looks like he's saying he doesn't believe in Jesus anymore at this point. Nevertheless, he was taught the gospel or Christianity or Christian values, whatever, and it didn't do him any harm. I mean, as you were saying, Paul, I think that, Christian values are what's best for society. I think I take that as an objective truth, actually. And they are the basis of the freedoms. They're the basis of the whole of Western civilization is Christian values. And we neglect them at our peril. And we will lose that value. And certainly we should be teaching our children Christian values and Jesus. And obviously, I believe that's true. And I'll go back to the resurrection and say, where's Jesus' body? And how come Christianity ever started, given Jesus rose from the dead? If Jesus didn't rise from the dead, how did Christianity ever start? And so on. But anyway, that's a whole nother debate.
Absolutely. But it is worth just thinking, like, in our equality-driven mindset that we have in our world with these human rights and these equalities, where we kind of compare one group with another all the time. We compare Islam with Christianity. We compare one, beliefs about gender to beliefs about religion. Then that has the effect of just flattening everything, as if flattening down everything to this sort of moral relativism, kind of this idea that all truths are equally valid. But that's not the case. Some truths are true. And one thing that is definitely not true is that you can be born in the wrong body. And yet that is what is being pushed through the teachings in schools, through things, groups online, where people will, young teenagers will kind of find trans influencers and decide that that must be what's wrong with them when they're going through puberty and feeling kind of out of step with their body. I must have been born in the wrong body. I want to stop this. And that's what leads to lots of these referrals, in my view. And it does bring us on to our last topic, which is really just to let people know about this important case that's happening next week that Christian Concern is supporting. There is a teacher who was dismissed, who we call Hannah. That's not her real name, but we have to, for legal reasons, give her a different name. And she was dismissed after raising safeguarding issues at her school and beyond her school in relation to a child who was joining originally her class, who was 8 years old and wanted to be known as the opposite sex. So wanted to identify as a boy rather than as a girl. She raised all kind of genuine safeguarding concerns through all the usual channels. But was just dismissed. The local authority and the school together were saying there's nothing to see here. We just want to let this child go on with it. And then Hannah kept on pushing because she had real reason to believe that this was not a good thing. I mean, any good Christian, any good sensible person knows that it's not a good thing anyway for an 8-year-old to be identifying as the opposite gender, but she had extra reason to do so. So she continued raising those safeguarding concerns. And because she did that through a judicial review, which we also helped her with, she ended up dismissed, supposedly for breach of confidentiality. So there's a really important case coming up next week where she's challenging that dismissal, where she was really just looking out for this child who's at the center of this situation. But she's lost her job because of that, and she's challenging that with our help. There's going to be lots of coverage, I expect, of this in the news over the next week or so. But what we'd really love you to do, if you're listening today, is to pray for Hannah and pray for her legal team. Pray that this hearing would go well, that she would be able to be really clear as she gives evidence in her case, as she is cross-examined. It can be really challenging for Christians who are put. Christians don't want to, well, no one really wants to be in this situation, and it's a very challenging thing to be put through cross-examination. So just pray that she would have clarity in terms of what she's thinking and what she's saying, and pray for her legal team as they support her. Tim, do you want to explain anything else about the case and what's gone on there?
No, not really. It's kind of shocking, really, that for raising safeguarding concerns, which ought to be like the biggest thing, red button, and she's kind of a whistleblower saying, here's an 8-year-old and I'm concerned about, the risk to them and whatever for their family and so on. And that this is a sensible thing. Do we really know that this is going to be good for them to socially transition aged 8 years old? Can we confirm that it's not a safeguarding risk? And she was, of course, branded transphobic for raising a safeguarding concern. That's kind of extraordinary because it's not very many years ago that the idea that a school ought to allow a child to socially transition, I mean, somebody who wanted to allow that would be regarded as a safeguarding risk in the school. Yeah. And here it's the person who doesn't want to allow it, or who wants to at least question it, who's regarded as a safeguarding risk in the school. I mean, all the people who want to allow this are the people who are safeguarding risks here. Because it's very bad for children to be allowed to socially transition. And we know that. We've presented lots of evidence about that to the Department of Education with Nigel Solly Rose case, and that plays a role in her case here as well. So it's a big deal. It's a very important case. It's going to be heard, I think, all week next week. It's quite a long case. And it's quite a contentious case. The whole trans lobby is very interested in this case as well. So do be praying for it. Do be thinking about it, because we really want to see her vindicated for what she did in the case of this child.
I would say that the WPATH leaks, one of the many things they talk about is social transition and how the evidence suggests that is in a way the most important problem, because if parents and others allow a child to socially transition without taking substances, then they're going to consider that to be their identity. And the vast majority of those that do that then do end up using these procedures and having these treatments. And also there's, as you said, you mentioned cancer as being one of the risks, but also in the British press, what's been talked about, there was a lady who's a research scientist who found that puberty blockers led to a lower IQ with girls who took them. And that, of course, goes against education. If you're, there's been a bit of evidence before about the effect to the brain, but as there's more evidence of effects to the brain, something like 12 to 15 IQ points that were lower, I think. And that's really quite a lot. I know that IQ tests differ and so on, but and she found it very difficult to publish in journals. The peer review process was suddenly not being made entirely fair for her because there were activists involved at that level. This is quite catastrophic when you think that there's a lobby of people who are so cynical and so obsessed with defending transition and gender identity ideology that they don't care about the cognitive outcome for the patients. So that alone should be shouted from the rooftops when it comes to a case like that, I think.
I think this is where the rubber hits the road, isn't it? Because we've heard so much, so much has changed in the last few years about how transgender ideology has been perceived, with the fall of kind of mermaids, the exposure of them, and of Stonewall and of Tavistock, and all kinds of things changing in that world. But now, what does it mean for an actual situation on the ground where you've got a school, you've got parents who want the child to transition, you've got a school that's kind of all for it, and you've got a teacher who is really standing up for the child, even if the parents don't really know it. What does it mean? How does this actually apply in this situation, which is why it's such an important case. So please do be praying for us and for her over the next week. Just one final comment here from Colin, just to clarify what he meant before. My point is that I had to confirm as an adult my childhood choice to follow Jesus, whereas a childhood choice to have your body messed with is not reversible. So I think his point is that he's still a Christian, he's still following Christ, but even if he weren't, then it wouldn't have messed up his body, it wouldn't have messed him up in the same way that going down this transgender rabbit hole would do. We're out of time today. Thank you very much to everyone who's joined and given their comments. Lots of really interesting points. We value them all. We love to discuss these things. I'm sorry we couldn't get to all of the comments today, but please do come again next week, where we'll have our last one before Easter, I believe. Last round the table before Easter. Please do come then next Friday at 1 p.m. if you can. We'll see you then. And if you're not already following our emails, following our other social media accounts, if you're not subscribing on YouTube, etc., please do that. You can also go to christianconcern.com/hello, where you will find a form to receive our emails, and we'll have an email out for you later today with some of the stories of the week and lots more coverage of some of these things. So thanks very much for joining us. Thanks, Tim and Carys, for joining me, and we'll see people next week. Thank you.
Cheers.
Thank you.